I want to talk a little bit about an old series I played recently. I want to talk about Xenosaga. So this game, if you know about the Xeno franchise, it has a weird history. I started off with Xenogears in the late 90s, and what happened was those developers, they wanted to make more games. Actually, it was purposely made so that that was like the game near the ending. I think they were being overly ambitious. They're like, oh, I want to make 5 6 part series, and this is gonna be the like 6 part in the series, and well, that's kind of stupid. But their plan was to make a whole franchise of Xenogears games. But what happened was it didn't sell that well, and the publisher said, no, we're not doing it. And basically, the developers have been going and making new companies and going to different publishers over the years. So then, Xenosaga is like a spiritual successor to the Xenogears franchise. Likewise, Xenoblade Chronicles is a spiritual successor to the Xenosaga series. Now, they're not really like actual sequels to each other. The thing is, when you actually play these games, there's only references between different games. Now, I think Xenogears is really off limits because they don't really want to use the likeness of any characters or anything because that was actually owned by Square, and they're a really big publishing company. You don't want to mess with them. But in the later games now, you can kind of see more references to Xenosaga and Xenoblade, more so than you would see references to Xenogears in that game. But basically, I never played Xenosaga. I played Xenogears as a kid, and even as a kid, if you don't know about Xenogears, what happened was it has a really ambitious early on plot. The games back then had to be played on multiple CDs because the CDs could only hold 700 megabytes of data, and even back then it wasn't really, they couldn't put big JRPGs onto one CD. So when you played the old like Final Fantasy games and stuff, they would often come with multiple CDs in the games. And yeah, if you bought used games, you would have to make sure you get all the CDs or you're going to be screwed. So I would always quickly flip through it, and they would give me dirty looks. It's like, hey, you're going to buy my game? And I'm like flipping through, I'm like, I gotta make sure I have the CDs, dude. Like, when you go to the pawn shop in the 90s. Okay, but seriously though, so back then, yeah, games had to be put on multiple discs, and what Xenogears was very famous for was having a shitty second disc, or in other words, a shitty second half of the plot. And I don't know all the details, there's been lots of speculation all over the place, but basically, well, actually, the director of the whole thing, like, he actually came out just like last year, and he actually explained the reason. I think that it was going way above the typical development cycle for games back then. Back then, games was supposed to be made like really fast. Back then you would have like 2 year development cycles, and they were going way over budget and over time and all of that. It made a big mess, so they made a second disc. And the second disc, if you don't know, basically imagine that you have an amazing plot, and during the second half of the game, all of a sudden you can't show the actual plot and cutscenes anymore. What happens is you instead have the main character in a wheelchair telling you what happens. That's what Xenogears pretty much is in a nutshell. I mean, I'm butchering the plot a lot. You can go to a different YouTube video and look up the whole plot if you want to find all of the specific details. But in a nutshell, that's what Xenogears was. And even as a stupid little kid, because I think I was like, I played it like a year or two after it came out, and I was like near the ending of elementary school, and I knew a lot of stuff. I wasn't like stupid, but kids are stupid nonetheless. But even as a stupid little kid, I knew that something was wrong. I knew that, like, what the hell did they do to this game? Why is he, old man in a wheelchair telling me the plot? And there was so many big and weird plot events, and literally, like, you'd have like plot events that would affect the whole world of the game, the whole lore of the whole universe in the game within like a less than 5 minutes, and you would get like some crazy plot event like, oh, everyone turns into zombies, or like, oh, all of the women in the game were reincarnated from the one goddess. Like, oh my god, that game was so stupid. I don't mean stupid, but it took risks, and it was ambitious, but it was crazy what they were trying to do. This video review definitely had spoilers in it, but They were woo. I don't think I've seen a plot as crazy as Xenogears, but I do not mean that in an offensive way. I mean, you know what I just told you? Like plot events like that, like oh no, like the guy's in the wheelchair. He's like, oh no, we everyone turned into zombies, but it's okay. We reached this aerial facility and spread magical particles that helped everyone. It's okay, you know. And then the other event where oh no, like all of the women in the world, they're actually the same woman, like it's all just one goddess. Oh my god, what did they do? But no, I'm being like a jester. Like the game was trying to be serious. The game wasn't trying to it wasn't trying to make itself look like a joke. But the problem was that they rushed the second disc so bad that yeah, it ended up looking like a joke. But no, the game had a satisfying ending. It wasn't like a Neon Evangelion kind of you know that anime from the 90s. It wasn't like a incomplete ending. No, they had a satisfying ending. Don't worry. But the whole series, well, it was supposed to be a series and it didn't. But basically, I ended up playing. I played Xenoblade games when they first came out. Played them on like the Wii, and then the Xenoblade Chronicles X, like a spin-off of that series, came out for the Wii U, and then I bought a Switch, got the latest one, Xenoblade Chronicles X. Sorry, Xenoblade Chronicles 2. And I played it over Christmas. I liked it, and I thought to myself, hey, I played everything else. Why not play through the 3 Xenosaga games? And okay, I'll tell you my story about why I didn't play them when they were first released. I was a really stupid kid, and every time I'd go to these, well, the thing is, I couldn't buy the games new back then. I'd have to go to like little mom and pop shops, which you know used to actually exist a lot in the '90s. I think I also used to use a lot of Blockbuster for the games too. But Blockbuster didn't have these games, so I went to a lot of the mom and pop shops, sometimes pawn shops, to look for them. And the problem was that these games, and I don't know why, I guess they named them after quotes. Well, they're actually plot events in the book, but in real life here, they're actually named after like these quotes and things from these German philosophers. So they have these German titles like Xenosaga Episode 1, Der Zill der Mash. You know, it's like this German kind of phrase. And when I was a kid, you know how maybe I don't know if you're really young. Now on Steam you can buy lots of shit, but in the old days consoles used to be like that. Used to have a lot of these games that were really shitty and like PS2, PS1 they didn't really care that much. And when you go into the old generations, you have really creepy, really weird games where how should I say it? It's like back then Sony didn't have like really strict regulations like nowadays for making games. Now there's so many regulations, you can only do certain things. It's not really open to the public. But if you worked in game development, you would kind of know what you can and can't do when you're making games. Both in terms of like storyline, what you can do, and like gameplay aspects. You know, you can't modify the console. There's requirements. You know, with user interfaces and stuff in your game can only do like certain things. So if you've worked there, you're kind of familiar with that. But back in the old days, people used to be really like you could buy like so much shit anywhere. And basically, why I never played Xenosaga was because I actually thought that these games were in German. You heard me right. Because all of these games would have these German titles with them. And I thought, oh no, I want to play the sequel to Xenogears, but I don't want to play this stupid German game. It's probably just some German game. And the thing is, especially if you go to used game shops and pawn shops, you're even more likely of finding a really shitty game. What I'm saying back then is, yeah, like, even though only games are only supposed to be able to play it in certain regions, I would always go to pawn shops and play the weirdest PlayStation 1 games. And, you know, as a kid, I thought to myself, because back then the regulations weren't strict, I was actually thinking, oh no, they're selling some stupid German game. I want to play like a North American version of it. And you know what? These mom and pop shops, the owners of them were kind of stupid too, because I'm like, you have the English version, and they didn't know about the game either, so they would actually be looking quickly through their stuff, and like, oh no, sorry, I only have this German version. And none of us would even be smart enough to like look at the back of the game to see English text. Now that I think about it, because you know how the games have front and back covers. I don't even know how that happened, but I remember memories. I was like to the guy, I really want to buy this game. I'd buy all three of them from you, but I wanted the English version. And even he didn't even check the back of it. Like, it was so stupid back then. We were all so stupid. But okay, seriously though, so I went back and played these games, and I'm thinking, why weren't they more popular? If they were more popular and people talked about it more, I would have probably bought it from like word of mouth, but I didn't hear much about it word of mouth. I used to hear about news from the old gaming sites. IGN used to be popular even back in the early 2000s, and I would always like look up gameplay videos and stuff, but you know, I just never bought it because back then you couldn't really buy stuff online as easily. In the early 2000s and late 90s, I feel like Amazon was still like a bookshop back then. But let me keep thinking. So Xenosaga, I actually bought the games, and what I did was I emulated the games the proper way. So what I ended up doing was I bought the games and then I ripped the games to get the ISO format, and then I emulated those because I don't have a working PlayStation console anymore. And I was thinking, why aren't these games more popular? And I can kind of see why. They were kind of lower budget games, and they dealt with heavy competition. It's kind of like that other game I played, the MMORPG game. Which one was it called? The last Recode remake, you know, for the Hack GU franchise. It's like that game. Really wonderful game, but the problem is that it didn't have the amazing graphics. Square Enix at the time, in the early 2000s, they were pumping out JRPGs, and their JRPGs like Final Fantasy X and Final Fantasy XII, oh my goodness. In terms of the graphics and the gameplay and everything, wow, those games would blow everything out of the water, including Xenosaga. So I've been playing Xenosaga, and these games, yeah, you can see that they feel like low-budget games. They have a lot of questionable decisions. And after the first game, in particular, after the first episode, you can see that a lot of people left, because you can tell that Xenosaga Episode 1 was made very quickly after Xenogears, and it has like similar art style. You can tell the same people worked on it, but the problem was that I guess maybe not enough marketing as well. It didn't sell well, and a lot of people left. Then they started changing the designs from Xenosaga 2 onwards. And the thing is, I liked the character designs in Xenosaga Episode 1 more. Like, the characters looked flawed, but, you know, it looked more fun. And I know in the old games, they were very cutscene heavy. So you'd see a lot of people complaining about the Metal Gear Solid franchise, but compared to these games where you would actually have 2 or 3 hour long cutscenes, like, I swear to God, the game would have prompted me to save like twice between some of the long cutscenes. Not even like, you know how some games, they want to be friendly. If you have an hour-long cutscene, sometimes they'll break the cutscene in half and put a save point in between, because they know that sometimes people are playing during thunderstorms, and that the game won't, you know, you don't want to like watch the whole thing again and stuff like that. Thankfully, they did allow cutscene skip in this game, but yeah, there was one cutscene so long that it had two save point breaks. It's so funny. But yeah, this game, it's turn-based combat. It's fun. It tries to be like Xenogears was, like you mash combos using combinations of a square and triangle. You can guard, you upgrade your character's equipment. There's a currency system, experience system. I know there's a SB point system. The gameplay mechanics will change game to game, but the storyline of the game is really amazing, but it's very narrative heavy. Kind of like how Xenogears could get narrative heavy as well, but the problem is that when Xenogears was released, that was the norm back then. You could have long cutscenes, because back then there was like barely any voice acting. No voice acting, and then, you know, you'd have to have characters like talk through lines of dialogue, but lines of dialogue could get lengthy, so it's almost like this game had they had a big script, but they tried to voice act it all out, which made it even longer. It's crazy, but they were ambitious, like Xenogears. Xenosaga was trying to be ambitious, but they didn't have the marketing, they didn't have the graphics, and in some cases they didn't have the gameplay. The gameplay in the second game was very controversial. I won't go into all of the details because it's lengthy, but they made a lot of controversial decisions. One of the very interesting things about Xenosaga was that you can actually see that they planned it out from the very beginning. Even when they made the very first episode of the game, they had most of the story planned out in advance. Like in the very first game, in one of the very first scenes, you can actually see a silhouette of one of the characters, and you can see that this character is actually it's actually one of the antagonists that you finally defeat in the third game, and I could tell because the silhouette of the character had a very distinctive kind of hair. And then when I was going back to edit my videos, I finished the third game, and I was going back and editing up my old videos and putting them up on YouTube. And what happened was I saw the silhouette, and then I instantly recognized it. You wouldn't recognize it going forward to the end, but when you finish the games and look back on it, I was surprised to see that, it was actually one of the characters later mentioned, and that, they actually planned it from the beginning. They didn't, plan out each game individually like you would expect. It's no, they actually planned an overarching kind of story. And the interesting thing about Xenosaga is that they actually did manage to finish the story, the whole entire 3 games, although the third game was rushed, because what had happened was they ended up doing the first 2 games, and then they did a third game, and then while producing the third game, they found out, the sales of the previous games are not doing too well. We want to finish up the series. We'll let you do this one last game. So then the developer said, okay, let's make this third game and finish it up. And you can see that the first disc of the third game is very slow paced, and then all of a sudden everything suddenly gets wrapped up in the second disc. It's not as bad as the second disc of Xenogears. The second disc of Xenosaga Episode 3, they rush it, but you finally take down all of the antagonists that were being built up in the previous 2 games. So overall, although I'm playing this game so many years later, it's just so interesting what they were trying to do. And I like to make similarities between Xenosaga and, these other games that were forgotten, like the .hack games, which was recently re-released on PC Steam. And it's just so interesting because they put so much emphasis on the story. And the first game in particular, it's like watching movie cutscenes, and it did this kind of concurrently with Metal Gear Solid, but a lot of people liked Metal Gear Solid's cinematics more than this game. And it's because this game, Xenosaga, it's kind of cryptic. It has so much lore, but when you put a whole lot of lore and high fantasy and all of this stuff into games, sometimes it's either they'll love it or they'll really hate it. And in this case, I guess people didn't really like the complex plot. Even myself is kind of included, because with Xenosaga, you would actually have to go and read a lot of supplementary materials to completely understand the story. You wouldn't completely understand the story from all of the lines of the characters alone, no. And the good thing is Xenosaga is that in the later games they actually include a lot of these dictionary entries, so you can read those instead of going back and forth and looking up stuff online. The lore of the game is complicated. It's kind of like if you ever played Tales of the Abyss. If you play Tales of the Abyss, they keep mentioning that whole game is it deals with the physics of some kind of particle entities called phonons, and I guess it's like their physics and chemistry. And what happens is they end up using the word phonon in every other sentence. And there was this funny webcomic regarding Tales of the Abyss, and you can just see one of the characters, Jade, he's constantly saying to the other characters, oh, phonon this, phonon that, phonon, and it's actually just so complicated because, it's they did so much work into making the game have its own physics and universe. And Xenosaga, it's not that bad, but it's almost like that because, all of these planets, all of these past events, and it's important to notice that Xenosaga, a lot of the game, the plot of it, it has to do with what takes place before the story happens. And yeah, like a lot of the previous events, like events that were back in time, they're revisited in the later games to try to help you out because so much of the plot actually takes place before the story actually even begins. And yeah, I mean, I just like the antagonist so much. I'm not spoiling anything, but it's just so interesting because initially I would think, oh, what's the point of some of these stupid long cutscenes in the first episode? But then you would see that these characters would later have major appearances, this kind of stuff, and that a lot of these cutscenes were not worthless at all. So overall, I think that yeah, if you're bored and tired and you don't have many JRPGs to play, and you want to get something cheap, I do recommend you playing Xenosaga. After I finished Xenosaga, I played all the Xeno games because as I said, I played Xenogears when it was initially released, and then I played the Xenoblade Chronicle games as they were released as well, and I just finished the second Xenoblade Chronicles, and now I ended up going to the Xenosaga, and yeah, that wraps it up. And overall, I think it's just such an interesting franchise. I feel bad because there was just so much competition in the PS2 days for JRPGs, so I can kind of see why when this game had released with heavy hitters like these Final Fantasy games and a whole lot of other popular games were coming out at very similar time frames, and people, especially kids, only had so much money to spend. I can see why people would choose the Final Fantasy games and the big JRPG series over something like this. It's sad, but it's true. But like looking back on it though, it's just so interesting to play. It really is a interesting phenomenon because I would always see these, especially at occasional video game developer conferences back in the old days. People would always mention this along with Metal Gear Solid as extremely cinematic, narrative-based games, and in some cases, yeah, the narrative of the game is better than the actual gameplay. Like Xenosaga 2, Xenosaga Episode 2, as I said earlier, it actually kind of has weird gameplay mechanics that a lot of people don't like. But instead, though, it has a really good story to make up for that. Though some of the games, I guess that game was rather short and it is criticized, but who can really think of a trilogy where the second game is actually good in a trilogy? Usually the second game is one of the worst in any kind of trilogy, but there are exceptions. So yeah, I keep saying it, I'll say it one more time. Definitely do play this game if you want to play, a JRPG that has a really interesting universe, interesting lore, interesting characters, and interesting plot. The gameplay is kind of funky depending on what kind of which episode specifically you're talking about. But in general, yeah, the gameplay could have had a lot of improvements. I mean, sometimes you do have to grind for either experience to level up the characters or grinding for money. And I know that in the later games, you have to spend exorbitant amounts of money to upgrade your mechs, because these games have mech components as well, where your characters go into giant fighting robots. But unfortunately, yeah, you have to grind the money to upgrade those parts, because a lot of the bosses force you to go into the mech. Well, it depends on what game you're talking about again, but the third game specifically, yeah, it forces you to use the mech on many occasions, and you have to keep that upgraded. If you enjoyed watching the content in this video, please give it a like. Also, please consider subscribing to our channel so that you can be the first to receive all of our latest content.